The sun hit the metal roof of my trailer like a blacksmith's hammer, 110 degrees. In the Nevada high desert, that kind of heat doesn't just make you sweat. It evaporates the moisture off your eyeballs before you can blink. It turns the air into something you have to chew before you can swallow. I sat on the warped plastic crate I used for a porch step, wiping the grit from my forehead with a sleeve that was already stiff with dried mud. The silence out here used to be my church, used to be the only thing that made sense. But today, the silence was broken by the sound of money. 500 yards away, across a sagging line of rusted barbed wire, the desert stopped being the desert. It stopped being brown. It stopped being dead. It turned into a violent, unnatural shade of emerald green. The Verde Canyon Resort. Grand opening day. I squinted through the shimmering heat waves. I could see the line of black limousines snaking up the freshly paved driveway. The chrome bumpers flashed in the sun, brighter than a welding arc. I watched a driver step out, opening the back door for a woman in a hat the size of a satellite dish. She didn't step onto the dirt. She stepped onto a red carpet that had been rolled out over the sand. It was obscene. It was beautiful. A breeze shifted, carrying the sound across the fence line. It wasn't the howl of the coyotes or the wind in the sagebrush. It was the clink of crystal glasses. The murmur of polite, expensive laughter. A jazz band was playing something soft, something that didn't belong within 100 miles of a rattlesnake. My generator sputtered behind me. It let out a metallic cough, wheezed, and died. Great. I stood up, my knees popping, and kicked the rusted casing of the machine. It didn't restart. The fan inside the trailer would be spinning down now, drifting to a halt. In 10 minutes, the inside of that tin can would be an oven. In 20, it would be a coffin. I looked back at the resort. Their AC units were humming, a low, constant drone. I could almost feel the refrigerated air pouring out of that massive glass lobby, wasted, just chilling the lizards on the patio. I reached for the plastic jug at my feet. It had been sitting in the shade of the trailer, but the water inside was still lukewarm. I took a sip, just a sip. You learn to count the swallows when the delivery truck doesn't come until Tuesday. The water tasted like plastic and calcium. I swished it around my mouth, trying to cut the taste of dust, then swallowed hard. My throat clicked. Down at the resort, near the edge of the manicured lawn, a group had gathered. They were holding champagne flutes that sparkled like diamonds. I recognized the stance before I recognized the faces. Troy Sterling, the mayor. He was wearing a beige linen suit that probably cost more than my truck. He threw his head back, laughing at something, his teeth white and predatory. And beside him, Alina. My stomach twisted, a hard knot of old affection and fresh bile. She looked like a queen. She was wearing white, a dangerous choice in the dust, but Alina never worried about dirt. She had people for that. She was pointing toward the mountains, tracing the horizon with a manicured hand, selling the view to a cluster of investors who were nodding like bobbleheads. Then Troy pointed. He didn't point at the mountains. He pointed at me. He extended his arm, champagne glass in hand, gesturing toward my rusted trailer, my dead generator, my pile of scrap metal. He said something and the whole group laughed. They turned their sunglasses toward me. I wasn't a neighbor. I was local color. I was the rugged, dirty, authentic desert experience they could look at from the safety of their misted patio. Glad I could be the entertainment, I muttered, my voice raspy. I watched them for another moment, feeling the heat rise through the soles of my boots. Alina glanced my way. For a second, just a heartbeat, her posture stiffened. She adjusted her sunglasses, turning her back to the fence. She knew I was watching. She just didn't care enough to stop laughing. A movement near the fence line caught my eye. A golf cart, white and silent, was bouncing over the scrub brush, kicking up a small cloud of dust. It pulled up to the barbed wire. A security guard in a uniform that was 2 sizes too tight stepped out. He kept the engine running. He walked up to the wire, careful not to let his polished boots touch the greasewood. "Mr. Gage," he shouted, "I didn't move. That's my name." "Mr. Sterling sent me over," the guard said, adjusting his belt. He was sweating, big dark rings forming under his arms. He looked miserable. "We've got the governor arriving in about 20 minutes for the ribbon cutting." "Good for him," I said. "Hope he brought sunscreen." The guard sighed. He looked at my trailer, then back at me. "Look, Colton, Mayor Sterling is asking. He's asking if you could move the trailer, maybe behind that ridge." I looked at the ridge. It was half a mile away. "This is my property," I said. My voice was low, flat. "I'm parked legally." "I know," the guard said, shifting his weight. "But it's visual pollution. That's what Mrs. Gage said. You're ruining the aesthetic for the photos. They're willing to pay for your gas." Mrs. Gage. She kept the name. She took the house, the business, the bank accounts, and the water rights. She left me with the last name and a patch of dirt that grew nothing but scorpions. "Visual pollution," I repeated. I looked past the guard, past the fence. I looked at the massive fountain in the center of their circular driveway. It was shooting a jet of water 30 feet into the air. It cascaded down into a tiered pool, sparkling, overflowing, gallons of it evaporating into the dry air every second. Gallons. Thousands of them. I ran my tongue over my cracked lip. I looked at my lukewarm plastic jug. "You tell the mayor," I said, "that my truck is broken, can't move it." "Colton, come on." "And you tell Mrs. Gage," I cut him off, staring directly at the fountain, "that she looks good in white. It hides the stains." The guard frowned, wiping his forehead. He realized he wasn't going to win this. He turned back to his cart. "Suit yourself, Gage, but don't expect any favors when the sheriff comes by." He drove off, the electric whine of the cart fading under the jazz music. I stood there, alone again in the roasting heat. The generator ticked as it cooled. 15 years ago, I stood on that same ridge where Alina was standing now. I held a geological survey map in one hand and a shovel in the other. I was the one who told her. I was the one who said, "There's an ocean under our feet." I found the water. I traced the basalt layers. I mapped the aquifer. I gave her the keys to the kingdom because I thought we were building a castle together. I looked at the jug of water in my hand. It was down to the last 2 inches. The music swelled. The governor's limo was pulling up. I could see the flashbulbs popping even in the daylight. Alina was clapping. Troy was shaking hands. They thought the desert was theirs. They thought money could rewrite the laws of nature. They thought they could pump the life out of this valley, turn it into a playground, and leave me to rot on the edge of the frame. I took the cap off my jug. I took a slow, deliberate sip. I swished the warm liquid around, feeling the grit of the dust between my teeth. I spat it onto the dry, cracked earth. The ground drank it instantly. I checked my watch. 11:58 a.m. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Alina," I whispered to the hot wind. "The tap runs dry at noon." The air didn't taste like dust back then. It tasted like electricity. 15 years ago, the sky over the Nevada Valley was a bruising shade of purple, heavy with a storm that refused to break. I was 26 years old. I had strong knees, a back that didn't ache in the mornings, and a geological hammer hanging from my belt loop that felt like an extension of my hand. I was climbing the eastern ridge, the one overlooking what is now the main entrance of the resort. But back then there were no paved roads. There were no fountains. There was just sagebrush, jagged volcanic rock, and a silence so deep you could hear your own blood pumping in your ears. Alina was waiting down by the truck. An old Ford with a bench seat we sat close together on. She wasn't wearing a sun hat or checking a phone. She was watching me, shading her eyes against the glare, her hair whipping around her face in the pre-storm wind. I remember the specific crunch of my boots on the scree. I was looking for something the previous surveyor had missed. He had labeled this land Type 4, arid non-arable. Basically, useless dirt suitable for snakes and not much else. That's why the price was $50 an acre. But he hadn't looked at the dip angle of the basalt layers. I climbed higher, sweating through my t-shirt. I found an outcrop of porous trap rock. It was fractured, a spiderweb of cracks running deep into the crust. I knelt, pulling my hammer. Clink. The sound rang out clear and sharp. High pitch. That meant density, but underneath. I swung again harder. I broke off a chunk of the gray stone. The underside was damp, not wet, just cool. I licked the stone, mineral salts and fresh moisture. My heart hammered against my ribs. I scrambled up another 20 feet, reading the landscape like a topographic map unfurling in my brain. The mountains to the west acted as a massive funnel. All that snowmelt, all that rain, it didn't just evaporate. It sank. It traveled miles underground, trapped between layers of impermeable clay, flowing downhill until it hit a subterranean dam. Right here. I was standing on a pressure cooker. I was standing on a cork bottling up 1 billion gallons of ancient water. I practically slid down the mountain, rocks tumbling around me. I ran toward the truck, waving the hammer. Colton, Elena leaned out the window, laughing. "Did you find gold?" "Better," I panted, bracing my hands against the hot metal door. "We need to buy it, all of it. The north section, the basin, the pan, we need to mortgage everything." She got out of the truck, her eyes wide. "Colton, we have $6,000 in the bank. This isn't a ranch, it's a desert." "It's not a desert," I said, grabbing her hands. They were soft then. "Elena, listen to me. We are sitting on an ocean. It's right there, maybe 300 feet down. If we drill here, we don't just get a well. We get an artesian spring. Enough to water 1,000 head of cattle. Enough to turn this whole valley green." I watched the gears turn in her eyes. She didn't see the cattle. She didn't see the hay fields or the quiet life I was pitching. She saw something else, something bigger, but I was too young and too stupid to ask what it was. "Are you sure?" she whispered. "I'd bet my life on it." "Then do it," she said, and she kissed me. It felt like a seal on a contract I didn't know I was signing. We bought the land a month later. Then came the labor. The sweat equity, as the lawyers call it now. To me, it was just work. It was the best work of my life. For the first 2 years, we lived in a camper shell. I rented a rotary rig with money I borrowed from my uncle. I drilled that first well myself. I spent weeks covered in bentonite clay and grease, sleeping 4 hours a night, listening to the diesel engine scream as it chewed through the granite. Elena was there, but she stayed in the shade. She started drawing up plans. While I was welding pipe, she was sketching guest casitas. While I was fighting a stuck drill bit, swearing and bleeding from my knuckles, she was on the phone with zoning commissions in Reno. I remember the day we hit the aquifer. It didn't explode like in the movies. It just hissed. A steady, powerful hiss of escaping air, followed by a gurgle. Then the water came. It was clear, cold. It came up the pipe at 40 gallons a minute without even a pump. I filled a jar and walked it over to where she sat at a folding card table in the dust. "Taste this," I said, grinning like a fool. "That is prehistoric water, cleanest stuff on earth." She took the jar. She looked at the water, twisting the glass in the sunlight so it caught the glare. She smiled, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the jar like it was a diamond. "It's perfect," she said. "We built the first house ourselves." Well, I built it. I framed the walls. I laid the hardwood floors, banging the nails in one by one until my forearm cramped. I routed the plumbing. I wired the electric. I remember late nights, exhausted, lying on the subfloor with the smell of sawdust and fresh rain blowing through the open framed windows. I thought we were partners building a sanctuary. I wanted a ranch. I wanted to raise horses and fade into the landscape. I didn't realize I was just the contractor. I didn't realize that every nail I hammered was building a stage for her to perform on. One night, just after we finished the roof on the main lodge, we sat on the porch. The sun was setting, painting the desert in reds and oranges. It was breathtaking. Alina was drinking wine, her legs curled up under her. She looked at the view. "We made it," I said, leaning back, the ache in my shoulders feeling like a trophy. "We built a home." "Home?" She laughed softly. It was a dark, rich sound. "Colton, don't think so small. We didn't build a home. We built a destination." She stood up and walked to the edge of the railing. She gripped the wood that I had sanded smooth by hand. "They're going to come from everywhere," she whispered. "Vegas, LA, Reno, we're going to be kings of this desert." I stood up next to her, placing my hand on her back. "Kings don't have to worry about neighbors," I joked. She didn't laugh. I followed her gaze. I thought she was looking at the water tower I had just finished painting. I thought she was looking at the pasture I was clearing for the horses. But she wasn't looking at the land. She was looking past the fence line. She was staring fixedly at the distant gray ribbon of the interstate highway, 5 miles away, watching the headlights of the semi-trucks moving in the dusk, counting the traffic, calculating the flow of potential customers like I had calculated the flow of water. She leaned into my hand, but she didn't turn around. "Imagine the traffic," she murmured. The air smelled like sage and promise, but for the first time I felt a cold chill at the base of my spine. I ignored it. I poured us another drink. I should have listened to the chill. The desert was honest. It told you exactly what it was. Alina was already rewriting the map. I just hadn't learned how to read her layers yet. It started with the boots. For 10 years, my boots were a symbol of the work we did. They were caked in red clay, scuffed by basalt, and stained with drilling grease. I used to leave them by the back door, and Alina would trip over them, laugh, and kick them aside. Then the renovation happened. The warm oak floors we laid together were ripped out. In their place came white Italian marble, cold, hard, and perfectly polished. "No boots in the house, Colton," she said one evening, not looking up from her iPad. "It scratches the sealant." I stood in the entryway of my own home, holding my work boots in my hand like a naughty schoolboy. The house smelled different. It didn't smell like dinner or sagebrush anymore. It smelled like lemon cleaner and ozone. It smelled like a hospital. I started leaving my boots in the truck, then the barn. Eventually, I felt like I was checking my identity at the door just to enter the space where I slept. The resort was booming. We had moved past the ranch phase and entered the resort phase. Alina stopped coming down to the well sites. She stopped wearing jeans. Her wardrobe became a wall of sharp black blazers and cream-colored silk. She looked powerful. She looked sleek. She looked like a stranger. Then Troy Sterling arrived. He wasn't the mayor then. He was a consultant. A fixer. He drove a silver Porsche that sat low to the ground, looking like a bullet chambered in the driveway. I came home one Tuesday evening, exhausted. A pump had failed on well number 4, and I'd spent 6 hours waist-deep in mud, wrestling a valve that had fused shut. I walked into the dining room, still wiping grease from my knuckles. They were already eating. A catered dinner. Alina sat at the head of the table. Troy sat at her right. "Oh," Alina said. Her tone wasn't welcoming. It was an apology to him. Troy turned in his chair, swirling a glass of red wine. He looked me up and down with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "The Earth Mover returns," he said. His voice was smooth, like oil on water. "Pump broke," I said, reaching for a chair next to Alina. Troy's nose twitched. He leaned back slightly. "Colton, old sport," he said, holding up a hand. "I don't mean to be rude, but you have a certain bouquet sulfur." "Decaying organic matter." I froze. "It's mud, Troy. It's the dirt that pays for that wine." Alina put her fork down. The silver clicked sharply against the china. "Colton, please, we have guests. Troy is sensitive to smells." "I'm sensitive to work." I asked, looking at her. "Just shower, honey," she said, her voice dropping to that patronizing register she used for the staff. "And maybe sit at the far end. We're discussing the zoning for the East Wing." I stood there for a long moment. My house, my table, my wife. I walked to the end of the table. I didn't sit. I grabbed a roll from the basket, took a bite, and walked out. Behind me, I heard Troy chuckle. "Rustic," he said, "it only got worse." The silence grew heavy. I was slowly erased from the emails. The calendar invites stopped coming. One morning, I walked into the conference room at the main lodge. I had the hydrology reports in my hand. "Elena," I said, pushing open the glass door, "we can't add the third pool. The recharge rate on the aquifer is down 10% this quarter if we don't let it recover." The room went silent. It wasn't just Elena and Troy. There were 4 other men in suits, bankers, investors from Reno. They looked at me in my flannel shirt and dusty jeans like I was a delivery driver who had walked into a board meeting. Elena didn't blink. She turned her chair slowly. "Colton," she said, "we're in the middle of a capitalization strategy session." "You're in the middle of drying up the well," I insisted, tossing the report on the mahogany table. "You can't print water, Elena. You have to wait for it." She smiled. It was the smile of a parent dismissing a toddler. "This is finance, honey," she said softly. "Leave the business to the adults. You just go play with your rocks. We'll handle the flow charts." Troy leaned over and whispered something to the banker on his left. The banker smirked. I left the room. The door hissed shut behind me, sealing off the cool air. I felt small. I felt like an obsolete machine, an old tractor rusting in a field because they bought a new combine. But the final blow didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened at home. I had been away for 3 days, surveying the northern boundary, camping out to check the feral horse migration patterns. I came home late, tired, looking forward to sitting in my study, the one room left that was mine. It had my old maps, my rock collection, the first architectural sketches we made on napkins. I opened the door. The maps were gone. The mahogany desk I'd built, gone. The room was bright white. Mirrors covered the walls. A treadmill and a Peloton bike sat in the center of the floor. "Surprise," Elena said from the doorway behind me. I spun around. "Where is my stuff?" "In storage," she said breezily. "Troy's trainer said I needed a dedicated cardio space. You never used this room anyway." "I used it every day," I said, my voice shaking. "It was my office. It was a clutter closet, Colton. Now it's functional." She turned to walk away. "Dinner is at 7. Try to be clean." I didn't eat dinner. I walked out to the workshop garage. I needed to breathe. I needed to find something familiar. On the workbench, shoved aside near a stack of old magazines, I saw a large foam board model. It was covered in plastic sheeting. I pulled the plastic back. It was an architectural model. VERD Canyon, Phase 3. It was a monstrosity. A 5-story hotel tower with glass balconies, surrounded by 2 more Olympic-sized pools and a decorative river system. I leaned closer, tracing the layout. The hotel wasn't positioned near the lodge. It was positioned further south. Right on top of the old paddock. The stable, my stable, the only thing I had kept for myself. The place where I kept the 2-quarter horses that reminded me I was still a rancher. The place where I went to escape the perfume and the lies. The model showed the stable erased, bulldozed, replaced by a concrete foundation and a martini lounge. I stared at the little plastic trees and the tiny plastic people enjoying their cocktails on the grave of my sanctuary. They hadn't even asked. They hadn't told me. They were just going to wait until the bulldozers were idling at the gate. I touched the plastic tower. It felt flimsy, hollow. Elena wasn't just building a resort anymore. She was paving over the last evidence that Colton Gage had ever existed. "Kings of the desert," I whispered to the empty garage. My hand curled into a fist. I wanted to smash the model. I wanted to break it into 1,000 pieces, but I didn't. Because smashing it wouldn't stop them. They had the money. They had the lawyers. And apparently they had the keys to my house. I covered the model back up. The slow decay was over. The rot was total. The structure couldn't hold any more. I wasn't a partner. I was a tenant. An eviction day was coming. The pen scraped across the paper like a dry twig snapping. I stopped. I looked at the line of ink I had just started. My hand wasn't shaking. It was just heavy. It felt like it was made of lead. We were on the 20th floor of a glass tower in downtown Reno. The room was freezing. They kept the thermostat at a temperature that kept people awake and on edge. The air smelled of burnt espresso and copier toner. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the Sierra Nevadas in the distance, white and majestic. But in here, everything was gray. "Please continue, Mr. Gage," the lawyer said. He sat at the head of the massive table, a shark in a $3,000 pinstripe suit. He tapped the document with a manicured finger. Initials here, and here, full signature on the last page. I didn't look at the lawyer, I looked across the table. Alina was sitting there. She was wearing that white power suit again. Her hair was pulled back so tight it pulled at the corners of her eyes. She had her phone in her hand. Her thumb was scrolling. Up, up, up. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at the divorce decree that was severing 15 years of marriage. She was checking her email or maybe her Instagram. Next to her sat Troy Sterling. He wasn't her lawyer. He wasn't her husband. Yet. But he was sitting on her side of the table, leaning back in the leather chair like he owned the building. He was wearing a grin that showed too many teeth. "Is there a problem, Colton?" Troy asked. "The word's too big for you." I slowly lifted my head. "Why is he here?" I asked, my voice sounding hollow in the acoustic deadness of the room. "This is private." Alina didn't look up from her screen. "Troy is managing the transition for the corporation, Colton. Since the asset division involves the business entities, he needs to be present." "I built the entities," I said softly. "You dug the holes," she corrected. "We built the brand." I looked back down at the papers. Exhibit A, Division of Real Property. It was a map, a satellite view of the valley we had bought when we were kids. There was a thick red line drawn through it. On the left side of the line was the green part, the wells, the lodge, the new hotel towers, the water rights. Underneath, in bold letters, awarded to Elena Gage. On the right side of the line was the North 40. We used to call it the Devil's Pan. It was a geologic mistake, a flat, cracked expanse of ancient salt and alkali dust. Nothing grew there, not even sagebrush. Just a lone, twisted mesquite tree and an old rusted shed where we used to store dynamite. Underneath that gray, dead square in the same bold letters, awarded T.O. Colton Gage, I stared at the map. I was losing the aquifer I found. I was losing the house I built. I was keeping the dust. This. I choked up, clearing my throat. "This isn't an even split." The lawyer sighed. He opened a folder. "Mr. Gage, under the prenuptial agreement amendments you signed 5 years ago, the value of the brand intellectual property vastly outweighs the physical land value. Technically, Mrs. Gage is being generous. She is absorbing the corporate debt. You get the north parcel free and clear. No liens." "Free and clear," I repeated. "It's a blank slate, buddy," Troy chimed in. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. "Think of the potential. It's got great mineral potential. For dust. Maybe you can sell dirt in a jar to tourists. Call it cowboy glitter." He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh. I waited for Alina to stop him. I waited for her to say, "Troy, that's enough. We loved each other once." But she didn't. She just kept scrolling. The light from her phone screen reflected in her sunglasses. I felt something break inside me. It wasn't anger. It was too quiet for anger. It was the main support beam of my life snapping under the weight. I looked at the pen. I could fight. I could hire a lawyer. I could drag this out for 2 years. I could tell the judge that I found the water, that my sweat was in the foundation of every building she was keeping. But then I looked at her face. It was cold, smooth, Botoxed into a mask of permanent indifference. If I fought, I would have to look at that face for 2 more years. I would have to sit in rooms like this, listening to Troy laugh, listening to them rewrite my life until I didn't recognize it anymore. I was tired. I was so damn tired. I didn't want the money. I didn't even want the resort anymore. I just wanted the noise to stop. I wanted to be somewhere where the wind was the only thing talking. Fine, I whispered. I'm sorry, the lawyer asked. I said fine. I gripped the pen. I pressed it into the paper hard enough to tear the fiber. Colton Gage, I signed the first page. Colton Gage, I signed the deed transfer. Colton Gage, I signed the divorce decree. With every signature I felt lighter, not a good lighter. Lighter like a balloon that had been popped, shriveling up on the floor. I was signing away my past. I was signing away my pride. I put the pen down. It rolled slightly on the polished wood. Excellent, the lawyer said, sweeping the papers into a pile before I could change my mind. We'll have copies sent to to the mailing address we have on file for the North Parcel. The trailer. They were mailing my life to a trailer. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor, a harsh sound that made the lawyer wince. Elena finally locked her phone. She placed it on the table face down. She looked at me. Her eyes were empty. There was no victory there, just business. Just a task completed so she could move to the next item on her agenda. You can take the truck, she said. The company logo has been removed. Gee, thanks. I turned toward the door. The glass walls reflected my reflection. I looked old. My shoulders were slumped. I looked like a man who had been hollowed out. I walked to the door. I put my hand on the cold aluminum handle. Colton, her voice cut through the air. I stopped. A tiny, pathetic part of me hoped she was going to say she was sorry. That she would miss me. That I wasn't just a line item to be deleted. I didn't turn around. Yeah, the North 40 gets pretty hot in August, she said. Her voice was flat, practical. Don't come begging for ice when your AC breaks. We're running a business, not a charity. Troy snorted. I opened the door. The rush of noise from the office bullpen hit me, phones ringing, people talking, life moving on. Don't worry, I said, stepping out into the hallway. I won't be asking you for anything. I let the heavy glass door swing shut. I heard the magnetic lock click into place. Click. It sounded like the bolt of a rifle sliding home. I walked to the elevator, pressing the button with a thumb that still had a smear of blue ink on it. I watched the numbers count down. I was alone, I was broke, and I owned a piece of hell. But as the elevator doors opened, I realized one thing: I was free. The silence was the loudest thing in the valley. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a dead silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums until they ache. It was the sound of a land that had stopped breathing. I wiped the sweat from my eyes with a forearm that felt like it belonged to a corpse. My skin was caked with a layer of fine gray alkali dust. It was in my ears. It was in the creases of my neck. When I gritted my teeth, I could feel it grinding between my molars. I stood over the hole. I had been digging since sunrise. 5 hours. My portable auger, a rented beast that shook my bones with every rotation, sat silent on the ground. I had drilled down 40 feet. I dropped a pebble into the darkness of the pipe I'd hammered in. I waited for the splash. Clack. Dry stone. Nothing but hardpan and regret. Damn it, I breathed. The word rasped in my throat, sounding more like a cough than a curse. I looked at the map I had drawn on a napkin. By my calculations, there should have been a seepage fissure here. A vein of water running off the main aquifer. But the geology of the Devil's Pan lived up to its name. The rock here was impermeable. It was a tomb, not a well. Next to the trailer, in the sliver of shade cast by the awning, my dog, Buster, lifted his head. He was a red heeler, tough as old leather, but even he was broken by this heat. He panted, his tongue lolling out, pink and dry. He looked at his metal bowl. It was empty. A fly crawled across the stainless steel. I know, buddy, I muttered. I know. The guilt hit me harder than the heat. I couldn't provide water for my own dog. I was a hydrogeologist. I had found enough water to build an empire for the woman who left me here to rot. But I couldn't find a bowlful for the only creature that still looked at me with respect. I grabbed the cluster of blue 5-gallon plastic jugs from the back of the truck. They rattled hollow and light. I walked to the cab. The handle was scorching hot. I had to use the hem of my shirt to open the door. The interior smelled of baking vinyl and despair. I drove the 20 miles to town in silence. The AC in the truck had died 3 days ago. The windows were down, but the air blowing in was like the exhaust from a jet engine. I pulled up to the gas go on the edge of the highway. I didn't go to the pumps. I went around the back near the air compressor to the spigot on the wall. The owner, a guy named Mike who used to come to our Christmas parties, looked out the window. He saw me. He saw the jugs. He looked away. He pretended to check a receipt. He knew, everyone knew. Colton Gage, the water king, was stealing tap water from a gas station. I filled the jugs, one by one. The water came out cold. I wanted to put my head under it. I wanted to drink until my stomach hurt, but I didn't. I just filled the plastic containers, screwed the caps on tight, and hauled them back to the truck. My back seized up as I lifted the last one. A spasm of pain shot down my leg. I grunted, leaning against the dirty fender, closing my eyes. Is this it? I asked myself, is this the rest of my life? Hauling other people's water until my back finally gives out. I drove back to the Devil's Pan. When I killed the engine, the silence rushed back in. But then, as I stepped out, the wind shifted. It came from the west, from the resort. It carried a sound, a low, thunderous roar. It was the Oasis Falls. The artificial waterfall Troy had installed in the lobby courtyard. I looked toward the fence line. Through the heat shimmer, I could see the spray. They had turned the pressure up. A massive geyser of water was shooting into the sky, oscillating, dancing to some unseen music. It was a display for the lunch crowd. Thousands of gallons, shooting into the air, evaporating. I could feel the moisture loss on a molecular level. Every drop that hit the hot pavement over there was a crime against the desert. It was water that should have been underground, keeping the valley alive. I poured a bowl for Buster. He drank it frantically, splashing it on his snout. Then I heard the buzzing. It sounded like a hornet, but deeper, synthetic. I looked up, shielding my eyes against the blinding sun. Hovering about 50 feet above my trailer was a drone, a white quadcopter with a camera lens that looked like a black, unblinking eye. It was one of the resort's security drones. It hung there perfectly still. "Go away," I said, my voice barely audible. The drone didn't move. Then slowly it dipped. It lowered itself 10 feet. It tilted its camera downward. I knew who was watching the feed. It was lunchtime. Troy would be in his office or maybe on the terrace with his iPad. He was showing me off. "Look at him," he was saying. "Look at the dirt. Look at the failure." They weren't just starving me out. They were documenting the starvation. It was reality TV for the cruel. I felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the sun. It started in my gut and rose into my chest, choking me. It was a red, blinding rage. I grabbed a shovel from the back of the truck. A long-handled spade. "Get out of here," I screamed. I didn't recognize my own voice. It was jagged, wild. I ran toward the drone, swinging the shovel like a bat. The drone zipped up, easily dodging my clumsy strike. It hovered just out of reach, buzzing louder. It was laughing at me. I swung again at the empty air, stumbling over a dried clod of earth. "You want a show?" I roared at the mechanical eye. "You want to see what you did?" The drone did a little pirouette, a mockery of a dance. I spun around, blind with fury, and brought the shovel down as hard as I could onto the ground. I wanted to hurt the earth. I wanted to hurt the world that had allowed this to happen. Crack. The sound was sharp and sickening. The wooden handle of the shovel snapped in two. The blade stayed buried in the unforgiving, concrete-like salt pan. I was left holding a splintered stick. The vibration traveled up my arms, jarring my teeth. I stared at the broken wood in my hand. My tool. My means of fighting back. Broken, my knees gave way. I didn't try to stop the fall. I hit the dust hard. The grit pushed into my palms. The heat radiated up through my jeans, burning my skin. I stayed there on my hands and knees, staring at a colony of red ants marching through the dust. They had a purpose. They had a destination. I had nothing. The drone hovered for another minute, capturing the angle of the defeated man kneeling in the dirt. Then, bored with the lack of movement, it whirred and zipped away back toward the emerald green horizon. I was left alone with the ants. I closed my eyes. I felt small. I felt like the dust I was kneeling in. Dry, useless. Just waiting for the wind to blow me away. "You win," I whispered into the cracks of the earth. "You win." But the earth didn't answer. It just baked. The storm stripped the valley down to its bones. For 6 hours, the wind had howled like a banshee trapped in a canyon, sandblasting everything standing vertical. It had scoured the paint off my truck and torn the corrugated siding off my shed. Now the air was still. It was an eerie, suspended silence. The sky was a bruised shade of purple, the twilight mixing with the suspended dust that hung like a heavy curtain. I stepped out of the trailer, wrapping a rag around my mouth. The landscape looked alien. The familiar dunes had shifted. Rocks that had been buried for decades were suddenly exposed, jagged and naked in the dim light. I walked the perimeter of the North 40. I told myself I was checking for fence damage. The truth was, I was just making sure the land was still there. I reached the southwest corner near the edge of the wash. There was an old, twisted mesquite tree there. It had been dead for 20 years, its black branches clawing at the sky like burnt fingers. I used it as a marker. The wind had been brutal here. The earth around the base of the tree had been scooped out, forming a shallow bowl about 3 feet deep. The gnarled root system was exposed, hanging in the air like a wooden cage. I turned to walk away, booting a tumbleweed. Then I saw it, a glint. It was faint, just a dull reflection caught in the last rays of the dying sun. It was wedged tight in the tangle of the dead roots, half buried in the hardpan. I stopped. Metal out here usually meant trash. Beer cans from teenagers, mufflers from the highway. But this looked intentional. I slid down into the washout. I got on my knees, ignoring the sharp stones digging into my shins. I brushed away the loose dirt. It was a tube. A cylinder made of heavy brass, turned dark brown with oxidation. It was capped at both ends, sealed with something that looked like wax and lead. My heart did a strange, stuttering double beat. I knew what this was. I had seen pictures in textbooks during my sophomore year at geology school. It was a surveyor's canister. Late 19th century. Men used to die carrying these things. They would trek through the basins with mules, mapping the West before there were roads, marking the water and the gold. I grabbed the tube and pulled. The roots held it fast. I grunted, twisting it, fighting the grip of the dead tree. With a snap of dry wood, it broke free. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. I sat back on my heels, holding the cold metal. The seal on the cap was stamped with a symbol, a pickaxe and a drop of water. The Bureau of Reclamation didn't exist when this was made. This was private. "What did you find?" I whispered to the empty air. I pulled my pocket knife. I worked the blade under the lead seal, chipping away the wax. It was petrified, flaking off in hard chunks. I gripped the cap. My hands were shaking just a little. I twisted. Metal shrieked against metal. A cloud of rust puffed out. It didn't budge. I took a breath. I wiped my hands on my jeans. I clamped my forearm down on the tube and wrenched the cap with everything I had left in me. Crack. The threads gave way. I unscrewed the cap. A smell drifted out, smelling of old leather, linseed oil, and trapped time. I tilted the tube. A roll of material slid out. It wasn't paper, it was vellum, sheepskin treated to survive the apocalypse. It was wrapped in an old cloth to keep the moisture out. I carefully peeled back the cloth. The vellum crackled, stiff and yellowed. I spread it out on my knees, smoothing the edges. The ink was faded to brown, but the lines were drawn with the steady hand of a master draftsman. It was a map of the valley, but it didn't look like the maps I had used for the resort. This was older. The names were different. The highway wasn't there. I traced the lines with a calloused finger. I saw the mountains. I saw the depression that was now the resort. And I saw my land. The Devil's Pan. The surveyor had drawn a series of concentric circles right where I was sitting. Next to the circles, in a neat, flowing cursive, were notes: primary fracture zone, basalt intrusion. I blinked, the dust stinging my eyes. Fracture zone. My eyes raced down the map. The surveyor had drawn arrows indicating subterranean flow. On modern maps, the flow was always assumed to come from the west, from the mountains directly into the resort's basin. But this map showed something different. It showed the aquifer dipping. It showed the water hitting a geologic shelf, a massive granite wall underground, and being forced upward before spilling over into the basin. The Devil's Pan wasn't a dead zone. It was the lid. The water was right here. It was under 50 feet of cap rock under high pressure. This wasn't the edge of the aquifer. This was the intake valve, the entire system. The water the resort was pumping. It all passed through here first. My breathing grew shallow. This was geological gold. But geology doesn't win lawsuits. I looked at the bottom of the scroll. There was a second document rolled inside, a smaller sheet. Thick, bonded paper with a red wax seal, deed of claim and water appropriation. I read the text. It was dense legalese, written in the archaic style of the frontier. Rights to all subsurface flow, streams, and artesian pressures originating or passing beneath the defined coordinates. It was a senior rights claim. In the West, water law is simple: first in time, first in right. If you have the oldest paper, you are God. If your paper is one day older than the guy next door, you can shut his tap off to water your weeds. I looked at the signature block. A name I didn't know, Jedediah Vane. Then I looked at the date. I wiped a smudge of dirt off the corner to be sure. May 4, 1887. I sat there, the wind starting to pick up again, ruffling the edges of the heavy paper. The Verde Canyon Resort's original land patent was from the railway expansion. I remembered seeing it in the closing documents. It was signed in 1910. 1910. 1887. 23 years. The resort wasn't the owner of the water. They were a junior user. They had been sucking on a straw that belonged to this plot of dirt for a century, and nobody knew because the paperwork had been buried in a mesquite root since the Cleveland administration. I looked at the darkening resort in the distance. The lights were flickering on. The fountain was glowing purple. They were partying on stolen water. A cold calm washed over me. The despair I felt yesterday, the feeling of being small, of being dust, evaporated. I carefully rolled the vellum back up. I slid it into the brass tube. I screwed the cap back on until it locked. I held the canister against my chest. It felt like a loaded weapon. I looked at the glowing emerald jewel across the fence. I was here first, I said, and for the first time in 6 months I smiled. The basement of the County Hall of Records smelled like dead paper. It was a thick, musty scent, decomposing wood pulp, mildew, and government indifference. I pulled my cap lower, keeping my head down as I walked past the security desk upstairs. I didn't want to be seen. Troy Sterling didn't just own the resort. He owned the influence that lubricated this town. Half the clerks in this building were on his Christmas card list. If word got out that Colton Gage was digging into land patents, Troy would know before I got back to the parking lot. I took the stairs down. The air grew cooler with every step. The archive room was a tomb of metal filing cabinets and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like trapped flies. There was no one here except an ancient woman behind the counter. She was reading a paperback novel and chewing gum with a rhythmic, wet sound. I walked up to the wire mesh cage. "Help you?" she asked, not looking up. "I need the range books," I said. "Zone 4, Section 12, years 1880 to 1900. She stopped chewing. She marked her page and looked at me over her reading glasses. Her eyes were gray and sharp. Nobody looks at the physical books anymore, honey. It's all digitized, terminals in the corner. The digital scan has a gap, I lied. The file was corrupted. She stared at me for a long beat. She didn't recognize me. To her, I was just another dusty rancher trying to settle a fence dispute. She sighed, a heavy sound of administrative fatigue, and stood up. Section 12. That's the old mining districts. Nobody goes back there. She disappeared into the stacks. I stood there, tapping my fingers on the worn Formica counter. I kept glancing at the door. Every time the elevator chimed upstairs, my muscles locked. I felt like a thief, but I wasn't stealing. I was just confirming that I'd been robbed. She returned 5 minutes later, pushing a cart. On it sat a leather-bound book the size of a tombstone. The cover was cracked, the spine peeling. Dust motes danced in the air as she slammed it onto the counter. "Don't rip the pages," she warned. "We don't have budget for tape." I opened the book. The pages were thick parchment-style paper covered in handwriting so neat it looked like font. I wet my thumb and started turning. 1885. 1886. I found the year. 1887. My finger traced the columns. Land claims, mineral claims, cattle brands. Then I found it. May 4, 1887. Claim 404, grantee Jedediah Vane, parcel The Expanse, locally known as Devil's Pan rights, subsurface senior appropriation, irrevocable. I pulled the surveyor's vellum map from inside my jacket. I checked the coordinates. They matched perfectly. I looked at the column on the far right, status. This was where it would say void, or sold, or canceled. It was blank. My heart hammered against my ribs. In bureaucratic terms, a blank column was a miracle. It meant the claim had never been contested, never been sold, and never been extinguished. It had simply gone dormant. The county had forgotten it existed because the surface land was worthless alkali dust. Nobody cared about the water rights because nobody thought there was water there. Until me. I pulled out the current hydrological usage maps I'd printed from the state website. This was the data Troy used to show his investors. It showed the resort's massive wells, big red dots, pumping millions of gallons a day. I laid the transparency of the resort's pumping over the 1887 claim map. The geometry was undeniable. The resort's pumps weren't drawing from a stationary pool. They were creating a cone of depression. They were sucking so hard that they were reversing the underground flow. They were pulling water horizontally across the property line. They weren't just pumping their water. They were actively siphoning mine. I took a pen and a scrap of paper. I did the math. State standard flow rate for an industrial well is 500 gallons per minute. They had 6 wells, running 24 hours a day for 15 years. I scribbled the zeros. The number was astronomical. In water law, that wasn't just theft. It was unlawful diversion of a senior right. But then the realization hit me harder. The money didn't matter. The lawsuit for damages would take 10 years. I didn't want money. I wanted blood. I looked up Nevada Revised Statute 533. I knew the code by heart, but I needed to see the words. In times of declared drought, a senior right holder may issue a call on the river, mandating the immediate curtailment of all junior usage until the senior right is satisfied. I looked at the drought map on the wall. The entire county was deep red. Exceptional drought status. My hands went cold. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was the executioner. This paper wasn't a deed. It was a kill switch. I had the legal authority to turn off the Verde Canyon Resort. I could dry up their fountains, empty their pools, and brown out their golf course with a single piece of paper. "Ma'am." My voice was steady, too steady. The clerk looked up from her book. "I need to recertify a dormant claim. Form 102. She frowned. "You know there's a filing fee. If it's been dormant more than 50 years, you have to pay the reinstatement." "How much?" $12. I almost laughed. A multi-million-dollar resort. an empire built on fraud and eviction. And the price to burn it to the ground was $12. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a crumpled 10 and 2 ones. I smoothed them out on the counter. "I'll take it," I said. She took the money. She took the original deed I had pulled from the canister. She opened her stamp pad. I watched her hand rise. In that split second, I saw Elena's face. I saw her drinking champagne while I stood in the dust. I saw Troy mocking my smell. I saw the architectural model of the hotel built over my stable. They thought they were untouchable. They thought they were the gods of this valley. The clerk's hand came down. Clack, clack. The red ink hit the page. RECERTIFIED. Active. The sound echoed in the empty basement like a gunshot. She slid the paper back to me. "You're all set, honey. Anything else?" I picked up the paper. It felt heavier now. "No," I said, turning toward the stairs. "That's everything I need." I walked up the steps, out of the musty basement and into the blinding daylight of the parking lot. The sun hit my face, but I didn't squint. I wasn't searching for water anymore. I was going to war. Blue sparks cascaded onto the dry earth like falling stars. I lowered the welding mask, the smell of ozone and burnt iron filling my nose. The darkness of the Devil's Pan returned instantly, heavy and cold. "That weld will hold a hurricane," Miller said. He pushed his own mask up, his face streaked with grease and sweat. Miller was an old oil patch roughneck I'd known since my drilling days. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at the blueprints, quoted a price, and did the work. "It doesn't need to hold a hurricane," I said, tapping the cooling metal with my gloved hand. "It just needs to hold the pressure of the aquifer." We were standing in a trench I'd spent the last 2 nights digging by hand. It was 6 feet deep, cutting right across the invisible line that marked the subsurface granite shelf the surveyor had found in 1887. Sitting in the trench, bolted to a fresh concrete pad, was the beast. It was a 20-inch industrial diversion valve. Cast iron, painted red. It looked less like plumbing and more like part of a submarine engine. Connected to it was a digital flow meter, its screen dark for now, waiting to count the gallons. "I still don't get the plumbing, Colton," Miller said, reaching for his thermos. "You're tapping into the main artery here. If you open this valve, you're not just filling a well. You're going to depressurize the entire local table." "I know." Miller paused with the coffee cup halfway to his mouth. He looked at me, then he looked toward the resort. "That includes them. If you open this loop, their pumps will suck air." "That's the physics," I agreed calmly. "Physics," Miller muttered. "Right." He didn't know about the deed. He didn't know about the legal nuke I was carrying in the glove box of my truck. He just knew I was paying him in cash to install a bypass system on my own land. I climbed out of the trench. The night air was sharp. I looked west. The Verde Canyon Resort was glowing. They were running full diagnostics for the grand opening tomorrow. Spotlights swept the sky. The purple lights of the main hotel tower pulsed in a rhythm, and I could hear it, the low, constant thrum of their pump house. It was the sound of a giant heart beating, keeping that artificial paradise alive. They were sucking the life out of the ground. My ground. I walked to the truck to get the rest of Miller's cash. My bank account balance was currently sitting at $42. I had liquidated the meager $401K I had left. I had sold my spare tools. I had bet everything on iron and paper. My phone buzzed on the hood of the truck. The screen lit up, bright and intrusive in the darkness. Elena. I stared at the name. I hadn't changed her contact info. It still had a picture of her from 3 years ago, smiling at a beach picnic. A ghost in the machine. I picked it up. "Elena, security tells me your truck is still parked by the North Ridge. You're ruining the drone shots for the website home page. It looks like a junkyard. Move it. Now, no hello, no please, just orders from the Queen." She was worried about the aesthetic. She was worried that a rusty Ford pickup was going to blemish the pristine, filtered reality she was selling to the governor tomorrow. I looked at the text. Then I looked at the massive red valve sitting in the trench. She was arranging the deck chairs. I was rearranging the ocean. I felt a cold stillness in my chest. A week ago, this text would have made me scream. It would have made me throw the phone. Now, it was just data. It was confirmation that she had no idea what was under her feet. I typed a reply. Me, don't worry. The view is about to change. I hit send. I grabbed the envelope of cash and walked back to the trench. Miller was packing up his arc welder. "You sure about this, Colt?" Miller asked, counting the bills without looking at them. "You got a look in your eye. The kind of look a guy gets before he does something that ends up on the 6 o'clock news. It's just water management, Miller, agriculture." "Bullshit," he said. He tossed his gear into the back of his van. "This is a trap. I've built traps before. This is a big one." "It's not a trap," I said, looking down at the red wheel of the valve. "It's a correction." Miller slammed his van door. He leaned out the window, the engine idling. "Look, I took your money, so I did the job. But I'm telling you as a friend. You turn that wheel, you're picking a fight with money, and money usually wins." "Usually," I said. "Don't do anything stupid," he warned. He threw the truck into gear and drove off, his taillights bobbing over the uneven ground until they vanished onto the county road. I was alone. I slid down into the trench again. The metal of the valve was cooling, ticking softly in the dark. It was heavy, solid, reality. Alina and Troy had spent millions building a fantasy. They had imported palm trees. They had laid marble. They had bought politicians. They thought they owned the engine of this valley because they built the shiniest car, but they didn't understand the engine. They didn't understand that the engine wasn't the pumps. The engine was the geology, and I had just installed the ignition switch. I reached out and placed my hand on the cold iron wheel. It was locked in the closed position. Tomorrow at noon, when the sun was highest, when the governor was raising a toast, when the cameras were rolling, I would turn this wheel. I would assert my senior right. I would divert the flow to my intake. I would legally, physically, and absolute take back what was mine. The silence of the desert felt different now. It wasn't empty. It was holding its breath. "You started it," I whispered to the cold iron. I gripped the wheel, testing the resistance. "I'm finishing it." The pixelated image on my phone screen stuttered in the heat. I propped the device against a rock on the edge of the trench. The local news was streaming the Verde Canyon grand opening live. Through the cracked glass of my screen, the world looked bright, saturated, and fake. 500 yards away, the real sound of the applause drifted over the scrub brush, delayed by a split second from what I saw on the video. It was a surreal echo, a ghost of a party. I checked the time. 11:45 a.m. "Ladies and gentlemen," Troy Sterling boomed through the PA system. The feedback whine cut through the desert air. On screen, he stood on a podium draped in white linen. Behind him, the massive fountain, the oasis, roared, shooting water into the blue sky. He looked sweaty but manic, his eyes wide with the adrenaline of public adoration. "When we broke ground here," Troy shouted, gesturing with wide, preacher-like hands, "they told us the desert was dead. They told us you couldn't bring luxury to the wilderness without destroying it. But look around you." The camera panned. It swept over the crowd of investors, the governor fanning himself with a program, the women in sundresses holding melting sorbets. "We have created a sustainable paradise," Troy declared, "a closed-loop miracle of modern engineering. We aren't taking from the land, we are partnering with it." I laughed. It was a dry, rasping sound. Sustainable. They were pumping 3 million gallons a month to keep non-native palm trees from turning into husks. They were draining the geologic battery of this valley to chill cocktails. "Partnering," I muttered, kicking a stone into the trench. "You're parasitic." Alina stepped up to the microphone next. She looked flawless. The camera zoomed in on her smile. It was the smile she used when she wanted something perfect, white, and completely empty behind the eyes. "Thank you, Troy," she purred. "We wanted to prove that elegance has no zip code." I looked toward the stage with my binoculars. I could see the movement in the wings. It was time. A waiter walked onto the stage. He was wearing the crisp black and white uniform of the catering staff. He carried a silver tray. On it was a single bottle of Dom Perignon and a thick, cream-colored envelope. The crowd murmured appreciatively. They thought it was part of the show, a surprise gift, a proclamation from the president. The waiter, a process server I'd hired named Carl, who charged double for theatrical delivery, approached Alina. He bowed stiffly. "Compliments of the neighbor," I imagined him saying, though the microphones didn't pick it up. He handed her the envelope. On the screen, Alina's smile faltered for a microsecond. She recognized the handwriting, or maybe she just felt the weight of it. "Oh, look," Troy said, leaning into the mic, ever the improviser. "A fan letter." The crowd laughed. Alina ripped the envelope open. She didn't use a letter opener. She used her fingernail, tearing the expensive paper. She pulled out the document. It wasn't a congratulations card. It was a formal legal command. Notice of curtailment, junior water RIGHTS appropriation. Pursuant to Nevada Rev. Stat. 533, demand for immediate cessation of PUMPING. I watched her face. This was the moment. The visual anchor of the betrayal flip. The blood drained from her cheeks beneath the makeup. She read the first line. Then she read the signature. Colton Gage, senior rights holder. Her eyes snapped up. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked directly at the camera, then past it, toward the dusty ridge where my trailer sat. Her expression wasn't fear yet. It was confusion. The cognitive dissonance of a queen being told she doesn't own the castle. She leaned over to Troy. She whispered frantically, shoving the paper into his chest. Troy looked at it. He squinted in the sunlight. I held my breath. If they stopped, if they announced a technical difficulty and shut down the pumps, the war would end in a courtroom. It would be boring, legal, and long. But I knew Troy. He laughed. He crumpled the paper in his hand. He threw his head back, showing those predatory teeth to the cameras. "My apologies, everyone," Troy shouted, his voice dripping with condescension. "My ex-husband apparently has a flair for the dramatic. He sent over a poem, a complaint about the noise." The crowd chuckled nervously. "He's always been jealous of success," Troy continued, crumpling the legal notice into a tight ball and tossing it behind the podium like trash. "Let's ignore the noise from the cheap seats, shall we? This day belongs to the future." I lowered the binoculars. They had done exactly what I needed them to do. They had been served. They had been warned. And they had publicly, visibly, and arrogantly rejected the law. They had just removed their own safety net. "You had a choice, Troy," I said to the distant figure on the stage. "You could have been smart. Instead, you chose to be loud." I picked up the phone and killed the stream. I didn't need to see the rest. I knew the script. I looked down into the trench. The red valve wheel waited in the shadows. The digital flow meter was blinking, 0 GPM. I checked my watch. The sun was directly overhead. My shadow had disappeared, puddling around my boots. High noon. The resort pumps were running at maximum capacity to fuel that fountain, the pools, the misting systems. The system pressure was redlining. They were drawing everything the aquifer could give. If I opened the diversion now, the vacuum pressure on their side wouldn't just drop. It would collapse. It was physics. If you poke a hole in a straw while someone is sucking on it, they don't get a drink. They get nothing but air. I jumped down into the trench. My boots hit the concrete pad with a solid thud. The air smelled of sage and impending justice. "They think the law is a suggestion," I whispered, reaching out with both hands. I gripped the cold iron wheel. My calluses scraped against the paint. Time to water the dust. I braced my feet. I took a breath. And I turned the wheel. The iron wheel groaned against the rust of my own hesitation. Then it moved. I leaned my full weight into it, gritting my teeth as the metal shrieked. One turn, two, three, thump. The ground beneath my boots shuddered. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something deeper. It was the sound of a massive, pressurized system rerouting its blood flow. The air in the new pipes hissed violently, a high-pitched shriek of escaping gas, and then the water hit. It slammed into my diversion valve with the force of a freight train. The heavy cast iron pipe vibrated against the concrete pad. The digital flow meter on the wall woke up. The red numbers flashed and started climbing. 50 GPM, 200 GPM, 800 GPM. I stood back, wiping grease on my jeans. The water was roaring now, rushing into my empty, subterranean cisterns that hadn't seen moisture since the Reagan administration. But the real show wasn't in my trench. I climbed out. I stood on the mound of excavated dirt, putting me eye level with the fence line. The heat was relentless, a solid wall of 110-degree oppression. I looked at the resort. Physics is a cruel mistress. The aquifer under the valley is like a shared milkshake. For 15 years, the resort had the only straw. They were sucking hard, keeping the pressure high in their lines to force the water up to their decorative summits. But I sat lower on the gravity shelf, and I had just opened a pipe twice the diameter of theirs. I was the hole in the bottom of the milkshake cup. I raised my binoculars. The first thing to go was the mist. The perimeter of the party was lined with cool mist pylons, spraying a fine fog to keep the wealthy guests comfortable. In unison, they sputtered. The thick, luxurious fog turned into a pathetic dribble, then stopped. The change was instant. You could see it hit the crowd. The governor reached up and loosened his tie. Women started fanning themselves with the glossy programs. The invisible shield against the desert vanished and the raw heat punched them in the face. Then came the main event, the Oasis Falls. That 30-foot geyser of arrogance, it faltered. The perfect, glass-like column of water wavered in the air. It pulsed once, twice, like a dying heartbeat. Then, with a sound like a giant coughing, the pump exhausted the available water in the casing. KAH chunk, WHEZ. The geyser dropped. It crashed back into the pool and didn't rise again. Instead, the nozzle spat a mix of mud, brown sludge, and compressed air. It sprayed the front row of the VIP section with a shotgun blast of brackish muck. The jazz band stopped playing. The drummer dropped a stick. Silence rolled over the party. The only sound was the wet gurgle of air bubbling up through the swimming pool drains. Panic. It wasn't a stampede. It was a social panic. The guests looked at each other, confused, hot, and suddenly aware that they were standing in the middle of a hostile wasteland with no protection. I saw movement on the stage. Troy was smashing the microphone stand. Alina was screaming at a maintenance worker pointing at the dead fountain. Then she stopped. She looked toward the ridge. She saw me. I wasn't hiding. I was standing tall on the dirt pile, my arms crossed, watching the numbers on my flow meter climb. 1,200 GPM. She grabbed Troy. He spun around. He saw me too. They didn't wait for a golf cart. They jumped off the stage and ran. They ran across the dying green lawn, through the perfectly manicured flower beds that were already beginning to wilt in the blast furnace heat. They hit the fence line out of breath, red-faced, sweating profusely. The expensive linen suit was soaked. Alina's makeup was starting to streak. "What did you do?" Troy screamed, his voice cracking. He grabbed the rusted barbed wire with his bare hands, not even feeling the barbs. "Turn it back on, we have the governor here." I looked down at them. "Can't help you, Troy." Mechanical failure, pressure dropped. "Liar," Alina hissed. She was gripping the wire too, her knuckles were white. "I saw the pipe, I saw the construction, you diverted the line." "I asserted a right," I corrected her. My voice was calm, low, it carried easily in the sudden silence. "Recertified deed 404, dated 1887, I have senior appropriation." "I don't care about your paper," Troy roared. "You are destroying a $50 million investment. You are bankrupting us." "Correction," I said. "You're bankrupt, you just didn't know it until the check bounced." I gestured to the dead fountain behind them. That water wasn't yours, Troy. You were borrowing it. The bank just called the loan. Elena stared at me. The realization hit her eyes, the terror. She looked at the guests who were now retreating toward the lobby, looking for AC that I knew wouldn't be working efficiently without the water-cooled heat exchangers. Colton, she pleaded. The tone shifted instantly. Manipulation mode engaged. Colt, please, this isn't a game. People are hot. This is dangerous. Just close the valve. We can talk about a settlement. We can buy you out. Buy me out? I asked. I laughed. Elena, you already bought me out. You bought me out for a shack in a patch of dirt. Remember, Colton, please. I'm afraid I can't close the valve, I said, checking my watch. My cisterns are empty. I need to fill them for my livestock. You don't have livestock, Troy screamed. You have a stray dog. I'm planning ahead, I said. It's called investment strategy. I slid down the dirt pile, walking closer to the fence. I could smell them, perfume and panic. I pulled my canteen from my belt. I walked over to the test spigot on my new valve assembly. I turned the small handle. Crystal clear, freezing cold water shot out. I filled the canteen slowly, letting it overflow. The water splashed onto the thirsty dust at my feet, turning the light gray earth dark. Troy watched the water spill. He looked like he wanted to lick the mud. I capped the canteen. You can't do this, Elena whispered. Tears were mixing with the dust on her face. We're supposed to be kings. You forgot the first rule of the desert, Elena. I reached down and scooped up a handful of dry, powdery dust from my side of the fence. Water flows downhill, I said. And history flows uphill. I opened my hand. The wind caught the dust. It swirled through the barbed wire. It drifted over their expensive clothes, coating their sweat-drenched skin in a layer of fine grit. A cloud of it settled onto the rim of the untouched martini glass Elena was still clutching in her left hand. Enjoy the drink, I said, turning my back on them. I'm just filling my canteen. Junior rights have to wait. Behind me, the sound of Troy kicking the fence post echoed hollow and impotent against the vast, reclaiming silence of the desert. The smell of a dying paradise is sweeter than you'd expect. It was a sickly, cloying scent, the smell of thousands of imported orchids and tropical hibiscus fermenting in the 100-degree heat. 48 hours. That's all it took. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, watching the collapse of Rome through a pair of scratched binoculars. The Verde Canyon Resort wasn't green anymore. It was 50 shades of brown. The manicured lawn, deprived of its hourly injection of water, had crispied into straw. The palm trees, roots shallow and shocked, were drooping like wet rags. But the real disaster wasn't the landscape. It was the plumbing. Without the massive flow of the aquifer, the resort's sewage system had stalled. The smell of raw waste was starting to drift across the fence line, mixing with the rotting flowers. It was the smell of truth. Underneath the marble and the money, they were just making shit like everyone else. I watched the exodus. It looked like a refugee column, only with Louis Vuitton luggage. Guests were dragging their roller bags across the gravel driveway because the electric shuttles had died in the heat. They were sweating, screaming into cell phones, demanding refunds that I knew the resort couldn't process. Troy was bankrupt. He just hadn't signed the papers yet. A cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. A white SUV with light bars on the roof. The county sheriff. I lowered the binoculars and took a sip from my canteen. I had been expecting this. The SUV crunched to a halt near the fence line. Sheriff Silas stepped out. He was a big man, built like a vending machine, wearing a uniform that had seen too many Nevada summers. Troy fell out of the passenger seat. He looked deranged. His linen suit was stained with sweat and dirt. His tie was gone. "Arrest him," Troy shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I want him in cuffs. It's sabotage. It's eco-terrorism." I didn't move. I didn't stand up. I just watched them walk to the barbed wire. Sheriff Silas walked up to the fence. He tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Colton." "Sheriff." Mayor here says you turned off his water, Silas said. He sounded tired. Says you hijacked the municipal supply. Not municipal, I said calmly. Private, and I didn't hijack it, I claimed it. He's lying. Troy grabbed the fence post, shaking it. He's stealing our water, we have guests fainting, we have a health code violation. Shoot the valve, Silas, blow it up. I reached into my shirt pocket. I pulled out the copy of the deed, not the original that was in a safe deposit box now, and the recertification receipt stamped with red ink. I walked to the fence and held it out. Recertified yesterday, I said. 1887 claim. Senior subsurface rights for the entire basin. They've been drafting off my source for 15 years. I just closed the tap. Silas took the paper. He put on his reading glasses. He took a long time reading it. Troy was panting. It's a fake. It's an antique. It doesn't mean anything. Silas looked up over his glasses. He looked at the red stamp. Then he looked at Troy. It means everything, Mayor, Silas said. His voice was heavy, authoritative. Water law is federal jurisdiction when it comes to these old land patents. Senior rights are absolute if Colton here was first. He lived in a trailer, Troy spat. He's nobody. He's the owner of the water, Silas corrected. He folded the paper and handed it back to me. According to this, you're the one stealing, Troy. Unlawful diversion, that's a felony if he presses charges. Troy froze, his mouth opened but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale beneath the sunburn. Fix it, Troy whispered. Silas, we're friends, fix it. Silas chuckled. It was a dry, dusty sound. He stepped back from the fence. He looked at the wilting palm trees. He looked at the chaos in the resort driveway. I can't fix geology, Mr. Mayor, and I can't fix the law. Silas opened his car door. He paused, looking back at Troy, who was gripping the barbed wire like a prisoner. You got a water truck coming? The sheriff asked. Cause you look thirsty. He got in and drove away. Troy stood there for a long minute. He looked at me. I saw the hate in his eyes die, replaced by a terrifying emptiness. He realized the game was over. The house of cards had fallen, and there wasn't enough wind left to blow it down. It had just collapsed under its own weight. He turned and walked back toward the dead resort. He walked with a limp. I spent the rest of the day listening to the silence return. The screaming stopped around sunset. The last car left. The power to the resort must have been cut, unpaid bills piling up, because the lights didn't come on. The emerald jewel was just a dark shadow against the purple mountains. Nature was fast. It was already reclaiming the space. I saw a coyote trot across what used to be the pudding green. I sat on my porch enjoying the cool evening air. Then I heard the sound, scratch, snap. It was the sound of metal tearing fabric. I looked toward the fence. A figure was struggling with the wire. They weren't opening it. They were trying to climb through it. I walked over, my boots crunching on the gravel. It was Alina. She was on her hands and knees in the dirt. Her white dress was ruined, torn at the shoulder, stained with red clay. Her hair was matted. She looked up at me. I almost didn't recognize her. The arrogance was gone. The queen of the desert mask had melted away. She looked like she had 10 years ago, tired, dirty, human, but broken. Colton, she rasped. Her voice was cracked. Her lips were parched. She tried to push herself up, but her arms shook and she collapsed back into the dust. She caught her hand on a barb, tearing the skin, but she didn't even flinch. She was past pain. Water, she whispered, please. She crawled forward, dragging herself through the gap in the wire. She looked at the puddle of mud near my boot where I had washed my hands earlier. She looked like she was considering drinking it. I stood over her. I looked at the woman who had mocked my poverty, who had laughed while I hauled jugs of warm water to keep my dog alive, who had built a paradise on my back and then evicted me from it. Please, she begged, a single tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. I have nothing. They took the accounts. It's all gone. I'm thirsty, Colt. I looked at her. I felt a surge of old anger, but it washed away quickly, leaving only pity. She wasn't a villain anymore. She was just another creature dying in the drought. I turned around and walked to the valve. "Colt!" She cried out, thinking I was leaving her. I reached for the spigot. I filled a tin cup. The water was cold, condensation instantly beating on the metal. I walked back to her. I knelt down in the dust. I didn't say a word. I just held the cup out. She grabbed it with both hands, shaking uncontrollably, and drank. She spilled it down her chin, gulping air, choking, then drinking again. She finished it and looked at me, her eyes wide, waiting for the lecture. Waiting for the "I told you so." I took the cup back. "The tank is full," I said quietly, "but the inn is closed." I stood up. "Drink your fill, Alina, then go. The sheriff said the next bus out is in an hour." I turned back to my trailer, leaving her sitting in the mud, clutching her throat, finally understanding the value of what she had thrown away. The frost sat heavy on the rail of the new porch. It was a real porch this time. Not a plastic crate or a rotting pallet, but rough-hewn cedar beams resting on a foundation of river stone. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic mug, letting the steam warm my face against the bite of the November morning. The trailer was gone. I had hauled it away myself, towing it to the scrapyard 3 months ago. In its place stood the cabin. It wasn't a mansion. It was small, sturdy, built from local rock and timber, materials that didn't fight the landscape but hunkered down into it. It had thick walls to keep the heat out and the warmth in. It didn't hum with air conditioners. It just breathed. I looked out across the valley. The sunrise was painting the eastern ridge in colors that no amount of money could buy: soft lavenders, burnt oranges, and a gold so deep it looked like molten metal. To my left, the skeleton of the Verde Canyon Resort stood silent. It was a ghost town now. The windows were boarded up. The neon sign that used to buzz all night had been taken down, leaving only the steel brackets rusting on the facade. The bank had foreclosed 60 days after the water incident. They tried to sell it as a turnkey operation, but nobody wanted a hotel without water. So I bought it. I walked into the auction with a cashier's check for 6 cents on the dollar. The banker looked at me like I was crazy. He told me the demolition costs alone would bankrupt me. I didn't tell him I wasn't going to demolish it all. I kept the barn. I kept the piping. I stripped the copper from the hotel towers and sold it to pay for the new irrigation lines. I let the oasis fountain dry out and turned the basin into a natural rock garden for lizards and quail. The golf course was the first thing to go. I spent weeks on the tractor, tilling up the dying Bermuda grass. I didn't replace it with sod. I seeded it with native bunchgrass, alkali saccatin, and wildflower mix. It wasn't emerald green anymore. It was a patchwork of sage gray and straw yellow. It wasn't a carpet, it was a pasture. And the water, I looked down at the trench where I had installed the valve. The red wheel was gone, replaced by a permanent automated restrictor. I still held the senior rights. The deed was framed above my fireplace, but I wasn't hoarding the flow. I had engineered a sustainable diversion, taking just enough to fill the surface troughs for the wildlife and irrigate the native feed, leaving the rest to recharge the aquifer deep below. The pressure gauges were stable. The water table was rising again. The heartbeat of the valley was strong and slow. Movement on the ridge caught my eye. I didn't reach for binoculars. I just watched. They came over the rise in single file, their breath pluming in the cold air. The horses. The same wild Mustang herd that Alina used to complain about. She used to call the sheriff to have them chased off because they looked messy against the backdrop of her luxury weddings. Now, they walked with a quiet confidence. A roan stallion led the way, his coat thick with winter fur. He stopped at the edge of the old fairway, ears twitching. He smelled the water. He trotted down the slope, his hooves kicking up dust that settled quickly in the damp morning air. He walked right past the ruins of the Martini Lounge and up to the stone trough I had built near the cabin. He dipped his head. The sound of his drinking, loud, rhythmic gulps, was the best music I had ever heard. 6 mares followed him, then a spindly-legged foal that looked like it had been born just before the frost. They crowded around the water, drinking their fill, their tails swishing softly. I sat perfectly still. Buster, lying at my feet, thumped his tail once but didn't bark. Even he knew the rules. This wasn't our water. We were just keeping it safe for them. I took a sip of my coffee. It was strong and black. There was no victory lap. There was no trophy. Alina was in California now, I heard, selling real estate again. Troy was under investigation for zoning fraud in another county. They were running the same race on a different track. I was done running. I looked at the water flowing into the trough. Clear, clean, ancient. For 15 years, I thought my job was to find things, to dig them up and give them a price tag. I thought success meant bending the rock to your will. I was wrong. You can't own the mountain. You can't own the rain. You can only borrow it for a little while, and the rent you pay is respect. The stallion finished drinking. He lifted his massive head, water dripping from his muzzle. He looked directly at me. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and wild. He didn't bow, he didn't flee. He just acknowledged me, one creature to another. He turned and galloped back toward the open range, the herd following him, disappearing into the sagebrush sea. I stood up, stretching my back. The work wasn't done. The fence on the South Acres needed mending, and I had a solar array to clean. But it was good work. It was honest work. I walked to the edge of the porch and tossed the last cold dregs of my coffee onto the ground. The earth absorbed it instantly, grateful for the drop. The wind picked up, singing through the canyon walls. It didn't sound like ghosts anymore. It sounded like home. I looked at the sun cresting over the mountains, flooding the valley with light. The desert doesn't forgive greed, but if you respect it, it might just let you live.